Hi, Jeremy.
Hey Daniel, so good to be with you.
Yeah, long way from it. It's little over a year ago that we met at a very auspicious place in the Oracle in Delphi in Greece, which was
That's right.
wonderful meeting you. I wish I could show that picture of the two of us with our smartwatch and penny. Maybe I'll put it on the top of this.
Right, yes, we should
But
definitely do that.
so much has happened since then. It's unbelievable. I mean, in 1 year with the pandemic and with political changes in your country, or hopefully changes,
Mm.
and yeah, the world's taken quite a spin. But I'm so glad that we have this opportunity to talk, and it's almost I'm falling into a groove. I'm noticing that I kind of like to start these conversations with not necessarily you telling your biography, but much more um, starting from that place where wherever you want to start in your journey to get to how did you come to realize what the gift is you came to share with the world.
Mm.
Like how did you really get into your essence and say, I've done this, I've done that, but boom, then this happened, and somehow it was clear that this is what I
Yeah,
want to do.
yeah. Well, um, my life really has it took a very big turn through what you might call like a midlife crisis or whatever, or just an existential sort of crucible that I fell into, because I actually spent the first half of my life in a very different way of living, where uh, I, I I grew up in England, where as a student I was a total just rejecting this ridiculous old style worldview that I saw around me, and just wanting something different with my life. I basically left Margaret Thatcher's England and came to the United States. But there, I married someone who had been a traveler all over South America, but she wanted to kind of settle down. And together, um, we made the decision that I would go get an MBA. And move into the sort of straight corporate world to help raise what became my two stepsons. And I spent years of my life I actually got my MBA at the University of Chicago, the home of the Milton Friedman folks, and started an internet credit card company. In fact, one of the first in the in fact, the first company in the world to allow people to apply for a credit card online, get approved in real time, took the company public. And then things around my life started crashing around me. My first wife, who actually passed away some years back, became very sick. I left the company to look after her. Within a short time, the company collapsed. And I went through years of purgatory where most of the people I knew, I'd lost contact with. I was looking after my wife, who was suffering cognitive decline, and I was basically lost really even that relationship, even while I was looking after her as she finally passed away. And it was this place of, as if the bulge I'd created around myself of values had shattered. And rather than go into despair, which was kind of an available option, if you will, I was more like, I'm really in this early part of my life still. Like, what can I do with the rest of my life that's truly meaningful? But I realized I didn't have an answer to that question of what is meaning. And but I knew that I didn't want to just take for granted whatever was being told to me. So I started this whole process of trying to sort of peel the onion, if you will, of meaning, and put a jigsaw puzzle together of all the different pieces of where meaning comes from. It took me years and years to do that. And it was both a cognitive search, trying to understand different cultures, cognitive science, evolutionary biology. It was also a kind of a spiritual search. And I discovered processes like meditation and traditional Chinese energy practices like Qigong. And so I was really transforming inside and in my understanding at the same time. But the whole point that I wanted was a place of finding meaning that could connect those two, where whatever was the source of meaning was both cognitively coherent, made sense to me, and at the same time made sense to my body. And I could see that the world that was offered to us, our mainstream worldview, didn't do that. So this was what led me to years of this kind of investigation, which came at one stepping point of that was writing this book, The Patterning Instinct, which was published a few years back. Yeah, thank you for
And it's
holding that.
quite a serious book, I
thick,
must
yeah,
add.
yeah.
This is a
But
serious piece of work.
but it's kind of fun to read too. It's in an accessible style, even though. But
briefly,
that book.
Yeah, just sorry to interject briefly, because it's quite remarkable. I know you'd written a novel before that,
Right.
But from one author to the next, how on earth did you manage to get a publisher to say yes to a book of this weight for your first book? I mean, it's a brilliant book, and of course, when they read it, they probably were immediately saying, "I want to publish this." But it's a lot of pages to get a publisher to agree to publish. Mine was very harsh in cutting me down on my book.
Yeah, no, it's true, and it was hard. And even that book was about 20% reduced compared to the draft that I initially had. So, I guess, and it took a while. It took a couple of years. It took a year to find an agent, a year for the agent to find a publisher. It was a long haul. And I was lucky to find this independent publisher, Prometheus Press, who's since been purchased, but that was really wanting to put out really thoughtful, progressive, intellectually stimulating books. And so I found the right place for the book. But what that book is, it's called the Patterning Instinct, and the subtitle is A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And in a way, that book represented the book I was looking for when I began my own search for meaning, but nobody had written it. Like, how does all these things come together? So it looks at the different ways in which different cultures have structured meaning into the universe, all the way from hunter-gatherer times to the present day. And it looks at how things shifted with agriculture. And it looks at how there was this massive split in our sort of ontological foundation in the West from East Asia about 2,500 years ago, and how that led to the shape of history. And one of the things I discovered in that, or the findings that arose from the book, was this simple kind of aphorism that culture shapes values, and that those values shape history. And as I did a lot of the research for this book over years, it was about 10 years of work, I also came to realize that our values today will shape our future. So it was only in the middle of doing this research that I really kind of began to uncover the incredible crisis that our modern world is facing. It was something that, just like many people in the mainstream, I'd been aware of the headlines, but hadn't really noticed how huge these issues are that our world is facing. And only did that when I started to read about these underlying questions of meaning for the book. So that book, The Patterning Instinct, ends, it comes all the way to modern times, looking at the underpinnings, the cognitive underpinnings of our modern civilization. And the final chapter is actually called Trajectories to Our Future, and looks at the different possible futures our whole global civilization is headed for, based on this notion that it's the underlying values and meaning making that leads to those directions. And one of those futures could be collapse. One of those futures could be what I call like a techno-split, like a bifurcation between the elites and the rest of humanity who are just left in the dirt. But there's this possible future of what we sometimes is called a great transformation or a great transition towards an actual flourishing path. And that's what I began to focus my attention on. And so a lot of my work ever since then has been, how can we shift our sense of meaning making? How can we shift where we're going as a global society to find that positive future?
And I mean, of course, it resonates a lot with the work that I've been doing, in the sense that, like, that little aphorism or that loop, culture shapes values, values shape history. From in my work on like both my PhD work in designing for human planetary health, and then later writing the book Designing Regenerative Cultures, for me the same loop of worldviews shape the way that we design the world, and the way that we design the world shapes our worldviews. That
Right.
also is a, like, very often people, actually most designers aren't even pulling back enough to understand what worldview and value system, what culture informs what they design and how they think a good design should be. But to even be aware that any design we design, continues designing, actually shapes our physical environment, which then shapes culture and what we value. So I think they're
Yes,
very
exactly.
closely aligned.
I
Uh,
completely agree. And in fact, in the preface of that book, The Patenting Instinct, I talk about exactly what you're describing. It's like a bidirectional transformation
mm,
where it's not just one way. And what's interesting is that the sort of modern classical way of looking at history that somebody like Jared Diamond established with Guns, Germs, and Steel, he was probably instrumental in helping to shift the view, was that actually it's called geographic determinism. It's a sense that actually humans are all the same everywhere, and history has been driven by how geography works. And in Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond does a great job of explaining how certain elements of the East Coast axis of Eurasia and different qualities about it led to that part of the world becoming more technologically advanced, which led to all the other things happening. And all that is actually a really profound and valid way of looking at things, but it misses the other part of the direction, which is that the cognitive shaping, the values cultures create, also then impact the history itself, and then, in fact, impact the actual physical environment through technology or through ecological breakdown, whatever it might be. So it becomes this two-way bidirectional feedback loop.
I wonder to what extent even Jared Diamond's work in that book is still strongly running through a cultural filter that is informed by who has written down history from what perspective. Because I mean, just the recent work that's been coming out again to remind people, it's nothing new in a sense, but that we in the West talk about Gutenberg inventing the printing press, but really those kind of technologies have been around for much longer in Korea and China.
That's right.
Replicating texts. Similarly, we celebrate, or luckily we've started to learn not to celebrate the beginning of a brutal era of colonialization quite so much anymore. But for a long time in your country, you had Columbus Day. You still have it.
Still is, yeah.
And so we celebrate the supposed discovery of the Americas by this guy called Christopher Columbus, when clearly we also know that other cultures have reached there first. And what I find interesting is that because Eastern cultures, like the whole historical thing of how China had this period where they were quite exploratory in the world and had a seafaring fleet and actually made it over to the Americas and so on. And then they made a conscious decision to contract and stay focused on the interior again. And
that's right.
I often find this Western arrogance that we think we've developed a high technology and high science and lots of complexity there, instead of understanding that what has been wrongly judged as primitive cultures, indigenous wisdom cultures, have consciously decided not to develop those type of technologies and develop other type of technologies of the sacred, technologies of collective meaning making, of storying and weaving yourself into place and into relationship that is life enhancing. And we have the arrogance to think that our technology is so advanced, and from seeing it from a different angle that I only really felt fully unfolding for me when I was given the gift to follow the journey of my daughter from conception to through my wife's pregnancy to birth, and now for the last 3.5 years. Once you witness the magic of two cells meeting and then developing into 4, 8, 16, 32, and then there's this embryo that runs through the entire journey of the evolutionary arc that looks like a fish for a bit and looks like a chicken for a bit, and then eventually ends up looking like a human. It becomes so ridiculous to think that our modern technology is so advanced. Like life's technology is so much like of course, our
Yes.
technology is also part of life, but life is just so much more advanced than that. And I think we need to reframe that whole, putting our little story of the last 150 years of high technology and high science into an even deeper rooted perspective.
Yeah. Wow. So agree. And there's such rich things you were just putting out there, Daniel. And I'd like to come back to that idea you just said. It's what in my next book that's coming out next June, I call it Animate Intelligence. And I'd love to come back to that. So why don't we like put a little placeholder there? Because before I do, I just wanted to touch on that first thing you were talking about, this notion of how we look in the West, we look at things through a particular frame and think that is the only frame to look at. And it's just so true. And in fact, that story you were saying about the Chinese technological advancement over the West is actually the story I begin my book, The Patterning Instinct, with. The person was called Admiral Zheng He, who is the admiral of this massive Chinese fleet, which, as you said, in the 15th century, decades before Columbus set sail, he kind of essentially ruled the whole of the Indian Ocean. He probably didn't actually come to the US. There's a theory that he did, but most serious historians who've looked at this say it's probably not the case. But what he did do, and there's absolute no question about this, the evidence is all there, historical, is he went all the way to the Middle East, all the way to East Africa, all the way to India, and to Sri Lanka. And wherever he went, he was viewed in some places like a god, because there were settled towns he would visit, there were more people. There were like 30,000 people in his fleet, more people than the town themselves even had that they'd ever seen before. They couldn't believe his power. And this is the whole point, that with that power, he could have, if he'd wanted to, just destroyed all of their livelihoods. He could have like found the gold. He could have like ransacked them and brought slaves back to China. He did none of those things. He looked for their emissaries. He asked whoever the prince was to bring back either that prince himself or emissary to China, to kowtow to the emperor and to establish trade routes. If there were pirates in some area, he'd use his power to basically keep them down, to keep the trade going, and to keep harmony basically in the system. And so oftentimes I'll begin when I'm talking about the patterning instinct with this question: why is it that Columbus, that same century, he had his 3 boats, you could have fit 10 of his boats into one of Zheng He's boats, and he had like hundreds of them. Why did Columbus change the whole world and Admiral Zheng He we haven't even heard of? And this is the whole point. When Western historians look at that, they say, oh, it's because he got there first to the United States. And that's what misses the whole point, because they're assuming that any culture, if they get to this other land, would, of course, they'd want to ransack it. Of course, they'd want to enslave it. Of course, they'd want to like find the gold and silver. But no, it's only the European worldview that led to that way of thinking, a worldview based on separation from nature, on seeing both nature and other human beings as basically resources to exploit. These were ideas that were utterly alien to the Chinese, to the Indians, to other, and also to the Arabs, who had this great civilization all through Eurasia, well before the West became powerful. These very ideas were simply not part of the way they made sense of things. And that's the key thesis behind this notion that culture shapes values and those values shape history. If Zheng He had come to the United States, one thing we can be absolutely sure about, he would never have conceived of the idea of doing what Columbus did, of looking at the indigenous people and saying, oh, great, let's enslave them. So we have to ask, what is it that's in that Western mindset that led to that incredible, that orgy of destruction that has really never stopped since then?
I feel moved because I thought about this book earlier, because to some extent I find the pattern instinct creates a much larger arch than what Rick Tarnas did in a small section focused
Right.
only on the West with this wonderful book, which I also
Yeah.
really love, The Passion of the Western Mind. But what he also reminds us in The Passion of the Western Mind is that there is an alternative that runs throughout the Western cultural and intellectual lineage as well. That people like Goethe and
Exactly.
so on or Steiner were expressing, and
That's right.
that somehow we just got tracked into this very strong separation worldview that particularly then since the scientific revolution, kind of the Cartesian
Well,
dualism.
and what I, in the patenting instinct, what I look at, actually a lot of the book is devoted to exactly this question. And in fact, that other tradition that you're just describing that Tarnas touches on, I call the moonlight tradition. Because in the West, it's as if it was there all along, but the sunlight, which is the primary dualistic tradition of separation, was so powerful that you don't even see the other light that's there. But if the sun's gone, you see there's a whole other kind of moonlight tradition, this kind of eclipse by the sun, but is there in the Western way of thinking. And you go, I look all the way back to ancient Greece as the beginning of these different ways of thinking. In fact, maybe even further back to the Proto-Indo-Europeans on the steppes in Russia, who really were the first to come up with a more separate, dualistic way of making sense of the world. But and in fact, their way of thinking led to India, to Zoroastrianism, and to the ancient Greeks. So that's the sort of the core seed. But we see it happening in ancient Greece, and we see the same concepts that structure that scientific revolution and the modern worldview were really first flowering in ancient Greece. The sense of there being like two dimensions to the universe, like a worldly dimension and some perfect, eternal, heavenly dimension that was fixed and perfect, and the world itself is polluted. And then they kind of modeled humanity itself in that same model, saying humans have a soul that connects us with that divinity that's also perfect, and we have this body that the soul is like imprisoned in, which is like the tomb. And of course, when the body dies, that soul is free to go back to that perfection. So everything was structured in terms of this dualism, this ontological dualism, which led very naturally to seeing the world as not having that soul. If the soul is what is our human thinking capacity, our reason, which how the Greeks saw it, then reason is divinity. And if animals don't show that same kind of reasoning, they clearly are not divine. They clearly don't have that same connection.
Yeah.
So it laid the groundwork for this mechanistic worldview, which became far more dominant than with Descartes and Galileo in the 17th century.
And of course, it stole the anima mundi. It killed
Yes.
in the mind of people, killed the anima mundi, and it created a justification for exploiting nature because nature became other and not as perfect.
Exactly.
But I love this term. Like, remind me the term you parked earlier for you, the next book that is coming out in June, where you
Right.
embodied. What was it?
So I call it animate intelligence.
Animate intelligence.
And in fact, much of this book actually looks at a completely different way of making sense of things. So maybe let me just preface a little bit what this new book is about, and then actually explore exactly what you were describing in terms of the incredible intelligence of your daughter emerging into the world in this beautiful way. But given everything we were just saying about this current worldview based on exploitation that people just take for granted. What this new book is that is being launched in June 2021, it's called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And what the book does is it lays down a coherent framework, foundation for an integrated worldview, one that actually it doesn't reject science in the slightest. In fact, the book is mostly based on modern scientific findings, but it shows how those scientific findings reject the dualistic, reductionist worldview that we've been taken for granted since the 17th century. And it shows the incredible deep interlinkage between modern findings in science, like complexity science, evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and the great insights of traditional wisdom from Buddhism, Neo-Confucianism, Taoism, and indigenous wisdom around the world. So what the book does is it shows how if we look at the greatest existential questions of every human asks, like who am I? Why am I? What am I? How should I live? Where am I? In each case, it shows how our modern answers that come from that 17th century outmoded reductionist way of thinking are not just dangerous and leading us to this destruction and this exploitation, but just plain wrong. And it shows how modern science revalidates those ancient findings and shows that actually we can understand the world in a far more integrated capacity, that everything is connected with everything else. It's really a worldview of interconnection. And as part of that, now to come to your point about animate intelligence, it shows that oftentimes we, in our Western way of thinking, view the only kind of intelligence that exists as that rational, what I call conceptual intelligence, the intelligence that the Greeks assumed was connecting us with divinity, the one that allows us to develop language and to build technology and to go to the moon and build the internet and to destroy the rest of the living earth too. And that's a very powerful intelligence. But there's another form of intelligence that each of us as humans have, that all of life has. And that's what we call animate intelligence. And this is one of the great findings of modern science and biology, is when we look at that self-organized animate intelligence, and it arises from self-organization, the incredible complexity that exists even in something as tiny as one single microscopic cell, or even in something that seems as still and kind of dull as a plant or a tree that seems like it's not doing anything, has an incredible complex intelligence that is still far beyond even our most sophisticated artificial intelligence. So I have a chapter called The Original AI, Animate Intelligence.
But in order to understand that, you have to understand the nested wholeness of life not being separated into individual species and genera like we like to do when we classify in biology, but that this animate intelligence is actually in the relationships on all scales, between atoms in a cell, between different components in a cell, between cells in an organ, between different organs that make up a whole body, between individuals in a family, in a community, and then out towards ecosystems and the biosphere. The entire, like, I want to pull out another book, if I can pull it out quickly, somewhere here, Animate Earth by Stephen Harding.
Stephen Harding, that's right, yes.
Like there's an inherent relational intelligence that isn't separated into ecological, economic, and social. It's all one in the entire system. And
that's right.
And one of the sources that we can draw insight from and meaning from is not through mind making, but because we're fractal of that nested whole, we actually store access to the entire intelligence. It's like, I mean, now I'm getting a bit, the entire world is storing that intelligence. And
yes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Peter Russell wrote this thing, the Planetary Brain, or whatever he called it. It's at least it's a organismic metaphor. I'm not going to go into a kind of supercomputer metaphor because that would be reducing the beauty of this. Is that what you're trying to express with this?
Yes, yeah, and that's, I go into a lot of that in the book, in the Web of Meaning, and looking a lot about how nature's, the principles of nature's self-organized intelligence, exactly as you're saying, are fractal, which means that they show themselves at different scales, all the way from a cell, all the way to Gaia, to the whole living Earth system, with ecosystems and organisms and species in between. And that doesn't mean that a tree looks a lot like the forest, or the forest looks like an ecosystem in terms of just the patterns of what it looks like. But the underlying principles of that animate intelligence that we're just talking about have been identified by evolutionary biologists now. They're beginning to piece together how nature actually does its thing. Concepts like modularity, concepts like in diversity, concepts most importantly about integration, about how each different part in a system is uniquely doing its thing and is also part of a coherent whole. And that's what you see in everything as tiny as a cell, all the way to an ecosystem, all the way to Gaia. And so once you recognize that, and there's this great term that Arthur Koestler first came up with called a holarchy. And the idea of a holarchy is this notion that each entity in a holarchy, this is as opposed to a hierarchy, that each entity in a holarchy is full in itself, it's a coherent integrated entity, and it's also part of a greater entity, and for the most part contains other coherent entities within it. So you can look at all of life on Earth as basically a holarchy. And the important thing about a holarchy is that it's not like a hierarchy in the sense that it's not like the top is more important than the bottom, or it's not like the orders or the intelligence or the directive comes from the top to the bottom, but it's actually both coming in and out. It's like the whole creates the parts while the parts create the whole, which is described using another term that I think Evan Thompson is a person who really coined this the best, called reciprocal causality, meaning that as the parts are causing the whole to be an integrated whole, the whole is actually having an impact on the parts. And that's how all of life works. And that's once we begin to recognize that, we begin to start to lead to a completely different set of values, a different set of how we make sense of ourselves, how we make sense of ourselves as humans in the living earth.
Now, it's fascinating because all of this is echoed in the work of Bohm, in the work of particularly Henry Borthoft's deepening of the understanding of Goethe's way of working. Because I mean, Henry had this wonderful article in the late 1970s, which was called "On Real and Counterfeit Wholes," and it's the first chapter in his book, "The Wholeness of Nature," where he describes this hermeneutic circle between the whole and the part. That the part is only a part in as much as it lets the whole come forth, and the whole is the part is only a part finding its meaning in the significance of the whole, and the whole is only a whole in as much as it lets the parts come forth. So this same reciprocal relationship. But what I'm wondering as I listen to you, because like lately, I don't know if you've picked this up, because of course this is everything you described is echoed in the language of Regenesis Institute and Carol Sanford with nested wholeness and this holarchic, where both parts and wholes at the same time. But when you mentioned the indigenous worldview, like just recently, there's been a little bit of pushback against permaculture visions of the future, regenerative visions of the future, stealing indigenous knowledge, repackaging it, and then I think that the article that went around was called "Whitewashing Hope," which they then went on to make a number of highlight in a very succinct and beautiful way some of the biggest caveats of Western culture, our problem with death and a number of other things.
Yes.
But they put it as quite a strong challenge against all those white people talking about regeneration, rather than reaching out to say we can deepen this conversation, and indigenous knowledge has a lot to build in there. And I was just thinking, you would trigger that kind of response with those people as well, the way you just framed this, and this notion that is it what we're partially engaged in, we're trying to build these frameworks of meaning in order to rescue the soul of Western civilization to some extent and bring us back into the family of life.
Mm.
Is this a endeavor that we have to do to heal our own culture, rather than necessarily, because or I would like to test this with you because I'm not quite sure whether I'm hearing you right. I'm just wondering, do we need one unifying worldview, or isn't that perspective you're speaking about of animate intelligence also allowing for the fact that this whole stores knowledge of itself through a diversity of worldviews that, if they've been around a long time, they're most likely to align with these life-sustaining patterns, because otherwise they wouldn't be around for very long. And our Western one is relatively recent. Yeah? But it's the kind of, I guess what I'm saying is there a plurality of worldviews that ultimately have a deep alignment in this understanding of whatever, the story of interbeing or the interconnected worldview, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah? Or does it have to be one worldview that we all kind of agree upon?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you raise these questions about indigenous wisdom and this and that whitewashing hope article. And I think I know the article you're referring to. And I guess just to be clear, I absolutely endorse exactly what they're pointing out in that kind of article. And I would hope that when the people who wrote that article and coming from that perspective read my book, The Web of Meaning, they'll find a lot to support in it, not to critique in it. Because a lot of what I'm trying to do in that book is showing the deep wisdom that indigenous traditions bring, that modern science, from a different perspective, is now beginning to rediscover. And I'm trying to show the interweaving between those, not to say, oh, we've got the answer now, but to actually look to this incredible rich tradition from different indigenous cultures across the globe, to show how we as in the modern world can learn so much from the ways in which making sense of the world that way leads to values, leads to behaviors that we need to incorporate in our world. So rather than trying to eclipse those traditions, it really tries to put them in places of really wisdom leadership for our future. And this is the whole notion about integration, is this recognition that there is this possibility for a unified way of making sense of things with diversity. And as you can think of integration as being exactly that, not trying to homogenize things, saying there's one answer, but saying with all these different diversities, but there is something that coheres it all, which is that sense of deep interconnectedness. So if we look at traditional indigenous wisdom, whether it's in what we now call North America, or what's now called Australia, or other parts of the world where those wisdom traditions have maintained. And we see it's all about recognizing that everything in the living world is all of our relations. And there's this notion of all our relations as being the fundamental way in which we look at humans in relation to life. And we look at human society. There's like values, which have actually, there's a indigenous writer, LaDonna Harris, who studied different kind of indigenous traditions around the world, and identified what she calls the 4 R's of what she calls indigeneity, which are things like relationship, reciprocity, redistribution, like these concepts, all of these concepts coming around relationship, building values, building human values, building sense of identity, and building a sense of how we relate to the natural world on the profound understanding of relatedness rather than separateness. So I would hope that exactly what we'll be seeing is, what I've tried to do in this book is show it's not about anything to do with putting the soul in our global culture. It's about really trying to look at a transformed way of making sense for humanity as a whole going forwards, where different cultural groups, different ethnic groups, and different regions can absolutely have their own way or their own autonomy, their own way of making sense of things, but share a sense of this deep interconnectedness, and losing this distinction that we have in the world today between science and spirituality, or between West and East, or between modern and ancient. But recognizing they're all different perspectives, which are great to have, but they actually all come from that same deep recognition of interconnectedness.
Yeah, and that deeper, because it it shifts profoundly when you understand that the biggest intelligence is in the interrelationship, not in the matter.
That's right.
Because then your own perception of self becomes a relational self. Like
Exactly.
you begin to understand that you can only be yourself in relationship to everything else that is. You cannot be in isolation because there's no way of relating. And yes, of course, science has come around with Maturana and Varela, and the Santiago theory of cognition is very akin to this. In the process of defining self, you bring forth a world.
That's right.
But the danger, and where I feel like if you're not very careful with the language, which you very often are very well, the trigger that I can see is that, and I'm not saying you're doing this, I think you're doing the exact opposite, is you're not trying to say, oh, here's Western science and it's finally proving you're right, you indigenous
Right.
people. So, well done. Oh, and
That's right. That's right.
us. Yeah, that's not what you're saying. You're almost saying like, okay, we should really eat some humble pie here in the West. We've done this detour and almost wrecked, or possibly wrecked, the entire planet in the process, only to find out with that science tool, as it improved and got better, that what we call the primitive culture was actually already there in the first place.
Yes.
And saved 2,000 years of destruction.
Yeah, I think it's really an important point that you're saying. It's not a matter of that sort of patronizing, oh, didn't they do well? Now we know. It goes the other way around. It says, like, since they developed ways of being and behaving and cultural attitudes and values based on that deep sense of understanding, there's so much that we can learn from that. But once science has come to realize that actually that relatedness is the foundation to make sense of things, because the West has very little experience in learning how to follow with the so whats of that. There's this wonderful leading thinker in complexity theory called Stuart Kaufman, who has written books about how complexity theory leads to this recognition of deep interconnectedness coming from self-organization. And I quote him a few times in the book with great respect. I mean, he's a fantastic thinker. But one of the things that he says is like, we're just beginning to understand, to make inroads into this brand new territory that we've never been before, this recognition of the deep like cosmos arising from complexity. And yeah, how are we going to like make sense of this? And what I say in the book is actually, Stuart, that's been explored for millennia, and not just in indigenous wisdom, which we've been focusing on, but also if we look at East Asian thought. One of the things that I actually introduce in the patterning instinct, but also look in detail in the web of meaning, is there's this great tradition that almost nobody knows about in East Asia called Neo-Confucianism. Most people know about Buddhism, Taoism, and there's this kind of sense of, oh, Confucianism is this kind of these, very family-oriented, very traditional, very social-oriented, and it's that's kind of mostly the sort of throwaway that people in the West have about Confucianism. But there's this there's this school of thinking that the Chinese actually call the school of the Tao, that formed in the Song Dynasty about 1,000 years ago, that actually they actually brought together three different strands of major thought in Chinese thought. One was Taoism, one was Buddhism, which had been around for 1,000 years or so in China at that time, and Confucianism. And they basically, by fusing those three together, they came up with a worldview that was based on relatedness. they looked at the whole universe and they said, actually, if you want to make sense of the universe, you've got to understand that it's all composed of what they call chi, which in the West, if we want to translate that, we can think of that as being energy and or matter. So anything that you could sort of measure physically, that's chi. But then they said just as important is the li. And what li referred to is the principles of organization of that matter. So the way in which the energy and matter actually comes together is what defines everything that we have. So the li essentially is the ways in which things relate to each other. And that was a huge point that they then explored. And the reason why we care about that is not once again to say, oh, how cute, they came across this focus on relationships that complexity theory and systems thinking is now focusing on. But from that, they developed very sophisticated ways of understanding how to look at the human relation with the natural world, how to look at values, incredibly importantly, how to look at our own internal self-organization as human beings. And there's centuries of deep thought there that we can learn from and integrate, not to try to go back to the past, but to try to move forward in a fully integrated fashion.
Is that the source of, because I often wondered, and I didn't dive into it in detail, should have done, the Institute of Leology, is that
Yes,
to that
that's exactly right. When I discovered this concept of Li years ago, it was like 10 years ago almost, something like that, I was actually reading Stuart Kaufman. I was describing right at the same time I was reading this great historian of Chinese thought called Joseph Needham, who wrote multiple volumes about Chinese history and science. He's considered the great classical sort of theoretician from the 20th century on this. And right as Stuart Kaufman, I was reading him going about, we look at these principles of organization we're just discovering. Here was Joseph Needham describing exactly, almost using the same words, what the Neo-Confucians were talking about 1,000 years ago. So this is where I felt Leology is this institute I formed, which basically, if you look at the word itself, it's designed as a neologism, which incorporates both East Asian and the Western way. The ology is like a study of, and the Li is the study of the principles of organization. But the whole point about the Chinese way, or the Leology way of doing that study, is it's not just a cognitive study. It's not just writing papers or getting intellectual, but it's an embodied understanding. And it's one that looks at the integration between, it's not like science, it's not like value-free science, but recognizing science comes with values, recognizing that mind is embodied, recognizing that the body has its intelligence, recognizing that those great traditions of the past can lead us into the future if we look for the right insights they can give us.
I'm just loving this so much because I'm just discovering how many, like this is Earth's intelligence, and this is Gaia coming back to herself in the microcosm fractal of Jeremy's story and Daniel's story. And I'm just, as we're speaking, really enjoying these parallels because like in 2001, 2002, when I was at Schumacher College doing my master's in holistic science, I'll send you a link to the thesis. In that thesis, I quote Kaufman, I quote Joseph Needham. I somehow stumbled across the Lee bit. I didn't catch that back then.
Right.
But exactly trying to make this bridge, that the thesis was called Exploring Participation and how to create healthy wholes. Like it's this whole shift that like Brian Goodwin, who was very influential, was a close colleague of Stuart Kaufman's. And he kind of, we got this sort of direct learning from the master on the real essence of complexity theory. And for me, it's summed up in this understanding that if we fundamentally recognize that the complexity of this nested wholeness that we're trying to approximate through language at the moment in this conversation is such that it is fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable, then the whole endeavor of the separate worldview of scientific endeavor of let's throw more data, do more studies, do more dissecting and categorizing and specializing, and then eventually we will be able to predict and control this complexity. We will be able to harness and master it, all the language that Bacon and so on brought in the scientific revolution. It just goes out of the window when you come back to the fundamental mathematically proven insight that as soon as you have three interacting variables, you're in a non-linear complex dynamic system that is fundamentally unpredictable beyond a very short time span in a very limited frame. Like you can predict it if you draw artificial boundaries that don't exist, but otherwise.
That's right.
And then the only, like Brian termed it in this, therefore there's a shift from prediction and control to appropriate participation.
Right, exactly.
And that then opens up this whole, how do we in the face of not knowing and uncertainty find wise action through participation. And when you were speaking about the animate intelligence, I was of course thinking of Stephen Harding's book Animate Earth.
Right.
And in it he kind of has this, it's actually work by C.G. Jung, this mandala of the four ways of knowing that have thinking, the intellectual analytical mind, as one of four, and have sensing, feeling, and intuiting. And really all three of those are about the relational, embodied, Nora Bateson would call it warm data, of being at one at the same time, in that dynamic that all life exists in, which is being as oneself and being as part of a larger whole. But the essence there is the being. The being unites the two, because we always are individual and indivisible.
Exactly.
And what, as I heard you earlier, that made me realize another parallel to my work. While right now I'm quite strongly focused on this, okay, how do we turn this around? How do we create regenerative cultures that are place-sourced and become healing and regenerative influences of the ecosystems they inhabit? So I think a lot about bioregional regeneration at the moment. And of course, going into the history of that movement, you come across this beautiful term that Gary Snyder coined, re-inhabitation. But as I heard you speak, I suddenly realized how deeply that notion of re-inhabitation also has a personal dimension, and this, like, now I'm coming full circle to that, or earlier with the indigenous Western conversation. I think that one danger that as we're bridging and coming closer to each other, and there's a long journey of truth and reconciliation still to be done, and acknowledging of the brutality of the past. But I think that's beginning. The danger is if we don't meet on the ground that we are all indigenous to Gaia, that even us Westerners who've gone on that confusing detour that almost brought down, or will bring down civilization as we know it, and has unfortunately brought down a lot of species in the process. Nevertheless, all my relations, that the essence of the indigenous worldview has to give each being the redemption of to use a very Western biblically loaded term, of actually being part of this, and therefore having direct knowing access to it. And that's where I was wondering, in this new book that is coming out, are you also weaving in the beautiful work of David Abram and this kind of more phenomenological sense? Like I just bought Becoming Animal. I loved Spell of the Sensuous. This coming home, like re-inhabiting our body in order to befriend and be able to listen again to these other three ways of knowing, and quieten the thinking, chattery mind.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, these are key themes. Everything you're describing is really what the book is laying out. All these different ways of being. And so, just to touch on a couple of perspectives, there's so many things you said that relates strongly to what the book's about. But one is as you're thinking about that, Jungian thing of those 4 different ways of that cognition and sensing and feeling and intuition. So if you really, those other 3 relates to this concept of animate intelligence, which we as humans have in us, just like any other creature has in us. Every one of our cells has it in us. So that's this recognition that we are life. It's not that we're separate from life. I've got 40 trillion cells here in me that are life, and they're all interacting with each other, and I am life. And I am, this beautiful quote from Albert Schweitzer, I come back to a couple of times in the book, that I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And that is the foundation of a value system that actually is truly life affirming. So from that, and then there's also this recognition, but humans are different too, because look at what we've done and look at the destruction we've done. Look at the, I mean, there's no question that there are some things that are unique about humans. And so a lot of my book goes into this recognition of this difference that we have, in the sense that we have this highly developed conceptual intelligence, in addition to this animate intelligence that we share with all other life species. And not to say that other animals don't have conceptual intelligence too, in different ways. But there's no question that with humans, through cumulative iteration over generations, is way more an advanced and bigger part of our cognitive capability than we see in other creatures, as far as we know, and certainly from the impact we've had on the world. So what I find so incredibly important is what I call integrative intelligence. That's the intelligence to actually, again, coming back to this notion of reciprocal causality, or the whole, is actually being able to develop the intelligence to be with our animate, intuitive, sensing, feeling bodily intelligence and that cognitive intelligence, but see them not as separate, but see them and look at the ways in which they can integrate to form a true integrated recognition of what we are as part of the living earth, what makes us unique as humans, and what makes us connected with all of the earth, and not seeing as those 2 things as leading in different directions, but looking at how they integrate. So that's a key element of where the book goes, is trying to show how we can, through our internal practices, which can be like embodied mindfulness kind of practices, to our ways in which we relate to the earth, to society, to technology, we can begin to look at how we can use that intelligence to be in the service of earth, rather than to be against earth. So we can look, for example, at this beautiful concept that Kat Anderson comes at, who studied the different ways in which Native Americans have been on, have sort of tended the earth, which is this concept of tending the earth, that we can actually find a way to live in symbiosis with the earth. So we don't have to view civilization as being innately destructive of life, but we can actually explore ways in which we can develop civilization that is actually symbiotic with the earth, taking life's own great secret of its intelligence, which is basically symbiosis, which is this recognition that different parts of life, different species, different microbes, or different organisms have their own specialties. But over evolutionary time, they found ways to relate to other species in ways that they can actually share their specialties together in a symbiotic way where each gains from the other's specialty. And it's not a zero-sum game. They're not doing it at the expense of the other entity, but they're actually both gaining as a result. That's how all ecologies work. That's how, when you walk in the forest, the plants get the solar radiation. They transmit it to the animals through what they offer the animals to eat, who then symbiotically move their seeds around to other places, which all move, or the waste goes into the fungal networks, where the actual fungus takes what it needs, which it can't create for itself, which is carbon, and it gives other minerals back to the trees and helps the trees even communicate with each other. And this whole process is this beautiful symbiosis, which is why ecologists can exist richly in profusion for millions of years, resilient and alive and changing with what goes on, but staying stable. So if we as humans can learn this great lesson of animate intelligence, the secret to life of symbiosis, and we can say, how can we apply that to our own ways of relating? then we have the potential to really find ourselves moving into a different way of for civilization to be in the future.
But I mean, you've just beautifully described what I would call the process of living the questions together and the process of creating regenerative cultures. I mean, coming back to that potential that we all have to be healers and custodians and tenders, or whatever you want to call it. Some call it stewards. All these terms can get dissected and have connotations for, but coming from a, if you listen more to the underlying connotation rather than the word, like the underlying intention, it's about being of a healing influence, of like that, precisely in that, rather than, like, I find that there's a danger in the current, on the one hand, it's wonderful that we're moving there, this conversation, we're moving from I to we, we're moving from ego to eco. They're all valuable cultural conversations where culture is shaping new values, to use your language, and therefore shaping our future as we have that conversation. But I see, precisely because, as what you've studied, this dialectic of thesis antithesis is part of the Western thinking trap. And so the dialectic of self to world, ego to eco, is also part of that same thinking trap. And we're just repeating a pattern of overswinging the pendulum.
Yes.
To,
right.
The only way to do it properly is to integrate a healthy ego by re-understanding the ego in that animate intelligence, relational self way.
Yes.
And then we understand that the I and the we unite in their potential to serve the whole.
That's right.
And the only way that the I can manifest its individuality, its uniqueness, the freedom of individualism that we hold so dear, is in service to the larger whole. And the minute you do that, then you really unfold your full potential, and you're part of a society that unfolds full potential. And that's when you align with what you say is that symbiotic process where life, or as Janine would call it, life creates conditions conducive to life.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, beautifully said, Daniel. Thank you. And this concept, what you're describing, in the book, I call it fractal flourishing. It's this notion that once we recognize that we as humans, as like any entities, are fractally part of these greater systems, and we have entities within us, living entities like our own selves within us, and we're part of these greater systems of relationships. And the flourishing arises from the ways these relationships occur, all the way to Gaia as a whole. We realize there's no possible way for one layer in that hierarchy to be healthy without all the different layers being healthy. So, and we recognize that actually our identity it's not that our identity shouldn't be at the level of the individual organism, that you or I are. Somebody hits me, I feel it. I mean, that's, but it's that one layer of these fractal layers of identity. I also have the identity of the community I'm with, of family. I have the identity of shared concepts and feelings of others around the world, the identity of being part of all humanity, the identity of part of all of life, the identity of being connected with the past and to future generations. So the issue is not so we should move from one layer to another layer, but we need to develop the facility for this integrated intelligence to be able to flow seamlessly through all these different layers at the appropriate moments, from moment to moment, from month to month, year to year, but even like conversation to conversation, so that we recognize that everything that we're doing can be for the interest of that fractal flourishing. So it no longer becomes like, is it me versus the society, or it's me, my individual liberty versus the collective. No, it's nothing like that. It's that each, in a healthily functioning ecology, every organism in that ecology actually contributes the most to the ecology by trying to fulfill its potential to the maximum. It's not trying, it doesn't have to sacrifice something, but by filling its potential in the structure, that is creating the conditions for all to flourish.
Yeah.
It's not doing it as a zero-sum game by destroying something else, but as part of something greater. And now that's not to say, and oftentimes people listen to this kind of conversation and say, well, what about the predators and the prey? And come on, give me a break. There's competition in nature. Like, that's all part of it. This is not trying to say, oh, nature's all about love. And no, but it's about balance between competition and collaboration. And if you look at the whole thing from a greater perspective, you get this concept I come to in the book, which we call harmony. And harmony, again, doesn't mean, oh, we all sort of agree with each other and we'll put our hands around each other's shoulders and you know, sing song together. What harmony relates to is the fact that if you have different notes in music, which are different from each other, but there's ways in which then they play together, they add to a richness that no one note can offer by itself. That's the concept of harmony that we see in nature that we can instill into our own society.
Again, it's just so fascinating and really gratifying, wonderful to play off each other. And here we're clearly framing very similar intimations of the same story. Like in my PhD work, Design for Human and Planetary Health.
Right.
That is exactly speaking to that fractal wholeness of how do we tend through the lens of design, which is kind of human intentionality put into action. It's just another way of framing the culture, value-shaped culture, and
right.
Culture shapes?
Culture shapes history.
Culture shapes history. And in there, I basically suggest that we need to do this pulsing, that when we design, that whether you design a product, you have to pay attention what materials and energies are used for that. But you also have to see where it sits in the house to not have a house full of off-gassing poisonous content. And then how the house sits in the community, in the ecosystem. It's again this nested wholeness of the design process where it doesn't serve anymore to just design it like, oh, I'm an urban planner, so all I do is design cities. You have to think about the entire planet, and you have to think about all the details of green chemistry and material science and circularity. But I want to take a little turn because we before we started recording, we agreed we wanted to come to one more topic that is obviously, as we're both speaking with such passion and such like fascination about this fascinating process of the whole becoming aware of itself through our eyes and our participation and role in all that, of what you were addressing earlier, that we're not some evil species that better die out quickly so the rest of life has a chance, but that we are part of life and a wonderful expression of it, and that we still haven't lived our full potential. We're a young species. That means that somewhere in us, despite all our studying of the current dire situation of cascading ecosystems collapse, biodiversity loss, climate change, and the loggerheads of the war of ideologies and all that, we must still believe that it's worth co-creating a future together. And you had an interesting exchange with Jem Bendell when he's suddenly burst on the scene with this notion as if nobody ever had understood that there was something collapsing before he reminded us, wait a minute, this is collapsing. How did that conversation resolve itself, or has it resolved itself? Because I still, like the way I have experienced it myself in the last 3 years, is that I felt that there was a greater alignment of different movements that were beginning to recognize each other as having explored different fractals of the same whole, whether it was eco-villages, transition town, permaculture, sustainable architecture, whatever, all those different people. And they yes, of course, they were coming from slightly different worldviews, and some of them were more techno-fixy and others were more systems transformation people, but they were beginning to kind of coalesce and say we're all part of this story. And Nenad Malkovich beautifully said that there's this term regenerative cultures, for him refers to all these expressions like the commons people, the peer-to-peer people, all of them. Yeah? And then suddenly with this deep adaptation conversation, there suddenly, for me, seemed to be a rift in that, where there was only one being for or against. Like, do you accept that everything is collapsing, and if not, you're in denial and come back when you've woken up?
Right.
And I just got really triggered by that. And then there's all sorts of wonderful conversations going on in the deep adaptation forum, but there's still a little bit of that note. Whereas if you look at the way that you've been looking at the long arch of history, or who else comes to mind? Robert Gilman from the In Context Institute. He has this beautiful era of time where he basically says the collapse of the age of empires, the collapse of the age of power over, that was a 5,000-year era from the beginning of agriculture, when we stopped being tribal and hunter-gatherers, to now, really started with the Renaissance. So really the last 250 years, that on the one hand was the rise of this industrial growth society to its ultimate perversion, was actually part of the collapse of the era of empires, and that all through the 20th century we've been in collapse, like, because we've been running a pattern that is deeply unsustainable. But yeah, I'd just love to speak to, have you ever made your peace with Ben?
Oh yeah, I have. In fact, he and I have been in touch with each other, and basically what I have to say to him is for the most part positive. I think that just by a little bit of background for anybody who doesn't have some of the context. So, of course, I assume most people know about Jem Bendell and the deep adaptation movement, and I wrote a couple of articles critiquing it, I guess a couple of years ago now, a year or two ago, where my critique of Jem was not so much to do with his pointing out how dire our situation is, but specifically, okay, yeah, thanks. I had something come on the screen. I wasn't sure if we just lost our connection or not. So my critique of him was specifically around the sense of the inevitability of collapse. So when he looks at all of the different things that he puts together, he actually, in that original paper that was so important to really wake people up, he kind of went from very like using phrases like very likely, or we're sort of moving towards that, to it's inevitable. And then he didn't really, it kind of like shifted between the two as if they're the sort of same concepts, but they lead to very different outcomes and very different responses. If you believe, and just looking back, in fact, part of my critique, looking back to our conversation earlier, where when we look at recognition of systems thinking, we look at the nonlinearity of complex systems. And when we're looking at what our civilization is going to do, you'd have multiple complex systems. First, you have the complex system of the Earth science, just the climate science and the Earth system itself. Then you have the complex system of human civilization. And then you have the complex system of how these two complex systems interact with each other. The one that you can say for sure about those, the future as it arises, as it emerges from all that, is that we can't know anything for certain about how those things are going to roll out. What we also do know is that each of us is part of that complex system. We're not separate from it. We're not out there in outer space looking back and saying, oh, I can see where this is going, it's going that. No, we're actually part of the decisions that get made that actually lead to that future. So it's not just that we can't know the nonlinearity of where the future is going, but it's the fact that our involvement actually affects that future. So with that, my concern was, I was reading not just from Jem Bendell's work, but people who became followers of Jem Bendell, the sense of inevitability. And there was one particular article that got written that led me to write my critiques, when it was somebody who was talking about a grandfather who was kind of feeling a little bit patronizing towards his teenage kid who was going on a climate march. And he was going, I don't want to tell her that what she's doing is a complete waste of time because it won't have any impact, because it's inevitable that we're going to have collapse anyway. So I tell her, well done, and try to feel good about it. And I was going, no, this is the path. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy that leads to destruction. And that's what was my critique, not to say that there's anything wrong. I actually really respect and admire the fact that Jem's work has raised the awareness of lots of people who otherwise weren't quite as aware of how dire our situation is. Anybody who's doing that, I applaud. But the so what is what I feel is so important. And to his credit, he doesn't actually advocate, oh, ignore trying to get involved. He's there with Extinction Rebellion, giving speeches. So I really have a good feeling overall about Jem, and I've transmitted that to him, and we've been in that conversation. But what I don't have a good feeling about is the messaging that says, just the very words, deep adaptation. Basically, it implies it's all going to hell. Nothing we can do. All we can do is adapt, and let's look at our local situation. And that also comes from a place of white privilege, because people in the global south, they don't have the ability to adapt. And if we just say, oh, we've got to just give it up as for gone, there's billions of people who have no choice but to be facing year by year the unfolding of this catastrophe. And anything we can do, even if we recognize that we're entering a place where our Earth is going to be a place unlike anything we've ever seen in the Holocene. There's going to be disasters up the gazoo. We're going to be suffering. But it still matters hugely. Every single fraction of a degree that we can shift, every single shift we can move against this growth in consumption to help to save the living Earth that is still left, really matters. It matters to every single crab, to every single starfish, to every single tree, to every single human being that is able to still have a life because of the differences that we can make right now. So that's where I kind of lead to, rather than thinking of deep adaptation, is what I call deep transformation. Because where Jem appropriately critiques people is a sort of so-called progressive techno-optimists who go like, oh yeah, we recognize we've got all these problems, but we can solve them. We can solve them by coming up with better technologies. We can solve them through these shifts. We can solve them through a Green New Deal that enables us to keep growing, but does so in a better way. That's where I agree with his critique. We need to look at the deep underlying framework of what's wrong with our society, and that has to change. And if you say, well, that's a long shot, we can't do that. I agree it's a long shot, but we sure as hell got to give it everything we can, because that's the only way we're going to be able to change direction.
Yeah, and also I think the pandemic has shaken so many people at their core now that I think that has actually will have a catalytic effect to that deeper questioning and transformation. I can see that with a lot of people, but I've almost, and I'm still sitting on the sitting with the paradox here. Like for a long time, I would tell people, okay, when you talk about resilience, you have to be very clear that there are actually three components to resilience. There's like, on the one hand, persistence. In the face of being pushed, the system just persists in its own structure and its old patterns. Then there's adaptation. Whether it's deep or not so deep, there's adaptation, which means there's such a deep shift in the context that the system has to adapt to it. But then the third capacity, which is only possible when you move beyond just looking at ecological systems, where the original study of resilience came from with the Resilience Alliance and so on, and you start, as they were doing, to realize that human beings are part of these ecological systems, and so they're really socio-ecological systems, and they have, through the human being, the capacity of anticipation and foresight. And then you add another dimension to this ecosystem, including humans, which is transformative capacity. And that's the capacity of that's what I would call regenerative capacity. It's transform, regenerate in order to respond to new context and be part of the evolutionary journey. And
that's right.
And so I spent a long time explaining this to people and highlighting the importance for transformative innovation rather than incremental changes. But what I've kind of realized in the last couple of years, and I'm wondering what you think about this, is that even that, if you make it too much of a pendulum swing, and like I pain because I know people who are working on new Green Deal type work, who are trying to shift the UN process, who are trying to transform reporting and the way business is done in market cooperation. And these are deeply committed human beings that some of them have been, in one case, literally Buddhist monks and spent their time in multiple Vipassana retreats. I'm thinking of Tom Rivett-Carnac, who wrote the book with Christiana Figueres, The Future We Choose. And is really like the unsung hero of the Paris Accord. And these people understand all of how urgent the crisis is. They understand that the shift is a deep systemic transformation that actually has to do with a worldview transformation. But they're still also working on incremental and transformative change with the structures that already exist, because they understand that every bit, as you were saying, every bit of slowing down the destruction and is actually contributing in this nested complexity to shift the enabling conditions. And we brought up Stuart Kaufman. Initial conditions are key components of emergence in a complex dynamic system. And if we, through a series of incremental changes and even a little bit of Green New Deal for the next 10 years, because culture changes, even if it can be fast in Kairos moments, it's still slow from a human lifetime perspective. I guess the question, to just not waffle on for ages, is I'm sensing that maybe it's not quite as black or white between incremental change and transformative change. Maybe we need to, instead of spending energy dismissing and fighting against the people that we see as incrementalists and, oh, that's not good enough, and you need to transform the entire capitalist system, you can't just do a cleaner production process. Why not do both, for Christ's sake? And yes, eventually we'll get that even the size of the entire industrial growth society is too big and we need to reduce it. There's lots of deeper transformation to come. But why are we always finding first the thing that we can be against, rather than find where we have a common underlying value base that we actually all care?
Yeah, so well said. And I what comes to my mind, Daniel, is this model that I actually learned from your own book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, that I now talk about a lot with other groups, is this concept of the three horizons model of change. And for anybody who isn't aware of the three horizons model, Daniel does a great job in explaining it in his work. But it's this concept of, there's the kind of short-term horizon, which is really kind of keeping things going as well as you can right now. The sort of middle horizon is really about a kind of disruptive change. So to me, the paradigmatic example of that second horizon thinking might be something like a Tesla, like rethinking the whole car industry so we can truly have a renewable car system from beginning to end. Fantastic. And that leaves behind the whole fossil fuel thing. But it's still only second horizon, because it's not truly looking at what is actually needed for a completely different sustainable future, which is that third horizon, which is more along the lines of this redesigning a whole system to be regenerative on a symbiotic level, of what oftentimes I'll write about as what I call an ecological civilization. But to the point about these three horizons, to me, the really key point is exactly what you're saying, that it doesn't mean that one is wrong versus the other is right. It means that whoever's working on any of those three horizons needs to be respecting that what they're doing is part of an overall process towards something that we truly need, and recognizing that those working in the other two horizons are doing work just as important, because you don't get to one horizon without passing through these other horizons anyway. But that also means that the way in which each of us does our work has profound implications, because once we begin to recognize that each horizon has a role to play, and that we're particularly focused on one of those, then we can begin to focus our attention on what is it, the work that we do that can lead to the next horizon. So there are some things we can do when we're in one horizon that might actually close off the ability to move to the next horizon. There are other things we can do which actually can create almost like on-ramps to move to that next horizon. And plus, we can also be in communication with those who are on that next horizon in whatever we're in, and respect the ways in which our work can actually move together rather than critiquing them. Because if you're in horizon one, you might say, oh, these other people, they're too visionary, they're too idealistic, they're not like dealing with the practical roots, the actual stuff that really matters. And if you're in the other extreme, you might argue, oh, these other people are too incremental, like that sort of Jen Bendel critique we were talking about. So I think that's important. But given that, we do have to recognize, even so, when somebody, for example, puts out this notion of green growth and saying, oh, it's possible to keep growing the economy and just make it green, that's in none of those horizons. That's actually turning around, and actually that's going deep into the darkness, kind of in the wrong direction, because that's based on a myth. There is no such thing as green growth. And, you know, there's a ton of work has been done showing that. Like Jason Hickel's written really well on this concept. It's a myth, and we have to recognize things like that to move forward. We can't just try to say things because they make us feel good.
No, but even there, I would say it depends on how you measure growth and what kind of growth you're talking about. Because of course, you just need to go for a walk in the forest to see that there is such a thing as literally growth everywhere all around us. Actually, it is the primary source of all value on planet life is photosynthesis and green growth. But it's nothing to do with economic growth with a green coat on.
Yes, exactly.
And that's where I find like our shared friend and mentor, Fritjof Capra, when you wrote that piece with Hazel Henderson by now 11 years ago on the distinction between qualitative and quantitative growth.
Exactly.
Really onto something important that could have been a semantic bridge, again, rather than saying it's all about anti-growth, degrowth, post-growth. I love people in all those fields. They're doing wonderful work. But all the framings are still in, again, the thesis, antithesis, pendulum swing, paradigm shift frame from this to that. And what is powerful about the three horizons, lots is powerful about the three horizons, but those three lines, the way that the green line, the third horizon, is already there in the present. It's much more prevalent in the future, but there's already pockets of the future in the present.
Yes.
And these are both past patterns like indigenous wisdom or new innovative patterns of whatever eco-villages, bioregional development, But it's also that the currently prevalent first horizon, the red line, doesn't completely disappear. So that's precisely inviting you to pay attention to the not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. What are the patterns of the old system that we actually deeply value and that we do want to continue? And then in the second horizon, which becomes the bridge from one to the other, you can do what you were just alluding to, this nuancing between which is actually a stepping stone towards making the third horizon come closer, and what is an innovation that seems new and different, like a Tesla car, but it's still as an individualized Ponzi ego-driven transport system. Oh, now I have an SUV that is electrical and looks like out of Blade Runner. So it doesn't actually shift the system. It's ultimately being captured by the first horizon.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the other thing that just you alluded to earlier with the danger of the deep adaptation framing is exactly because we've been there before. Like when the Center for Alternative Technology was founded, they moved to Wales because it was far away from London, because they were worried about a nuclear holocaust at the time. And they thought the bombs will fall on London and we'll have a chance to survive if we're somewhere in a valley in Wales. And similarly, a lot of the eco-village and intentional communities of the 60s and 70s also had these very remote rural hideaway lifeboat, let's build another system that when the old system collapsed kind of approach.
Right.
And it doesn't fully, it's still within the mindset of separation. It's still not fully understanding interconnectedness. It's pretending that a bunch of people in Totnes could create a bubble that will survive if the whole world goes to bits. Of course, I mean, I'm not saying anybody believes they're wonderful people there, yeah? But it's like I realized this when I lived at Findhorn, and you look at the wonderful vegetable gardens and the organic farm and the community supported agriculture system, and then it has the stark, like right next door is an RAF airbase, and then you sort of think, if things go to bits, like even if you have your little self-sufficiency haven, the people around you are going to go hungry, and then you have only two choices: either you share what's not enough for everybody with everybody, or you build a fence and you start the whole story of them against us.
Right. So exactly.
We all win or none of us wins. And that the deep adaptation and also that's, I think, the danger of misunderstanding bioregional development as well, is that it could be a coming back to the region and closing the borders. No, it has to be as Mitchell Thomas called it, a cosmopolitan bioregionalism, or kind of diverse regenerative economies for diverse regenerative cultures that all uniquely express our underlying unity. So yeah,
beautiful. Wow, thank you, Daniel. Well said.
But it also, like, because you have one more book in your big trilogy plan, and it's keeping relatively short, but in that book you use this framing that I heard first from the Chinese, this notion of an ecological civilization.
Right.
And
that's right.
I was wondering where you're at with this in terms of, like, I have a lot of friends whose thinking I respect, who would say the whole notion of a civilization, a planetary civilization, is too big for in terms of scale. So I guess it's about reframing what we mean by civilization in a way that then has that nested fractality and wholeness, or scale linking, health generating patterns, depending on whether we use your or my framing, but they're both talking about the same thing.
That's right. And so to your reference about the third book is that it's actually the book that is yet to be written, which is going to come after the Web of Meaning, which will probably be called Future Flourishing, Pathways Toward an Ecological Civilization. And this is a term that I got super excited about when I first came across it, not so much to do with the Chinese expression of it, because quite honestly, what I think we see in China is more like a form of greenwashing from that concept, because the actual way in which the very idea is being implemented in China is so far from the principles of what I consider to be an ecological civilization that I don't relate to it so much. But there is some hope that at least people are thinking about it in that way. I don't want to just dismiss it. But the concept of an ecological civilization is basically to look at what it would be like if we were to redesign our civilization from the ground up to be one that was life affirming rather than wealth affirming. And what I love about this term is it recognizes, just like we were talking about before, the need for deep transformation. It recognizes that our civilization itself has to change. It's not just a matter of making something a bit better. It's not a matter of improving capitalism. It's not a matter of making our civilization more sustainable. It's a matter of designing a different kind of civilization. And it's this notion of recognizing that we can learn from nature, which is why it's called an ecological one. And the thing that I think is so important about it is to realize that it's actually possible. This is not just some vision of something that's going to happen in some distant future, but to your point, Daniel, every one of the structural elements of an ecological civilization we see around us right now. It's like that great quote by the comedian whose name I don't remember, but the future is already here. It's just not very well distributed. And that's exactly
William
where
Gibson.
it's,
It's a
sorry?
it's a science writer, William Gibson, who
That's right, William Gibson, exactly. Thank you, I couldn't remember who. So this notion is that when we look at an ecological civilization and we design it from those principles of nature, it comes from the things like symbiosis, or this concept of fractal flourishing that we were talking about before. And then when you say, what does that mean in practice? Well, for starters, it would mean the transnational corporations that right now are essentially controlling every aspect of our global society would have to be fundamentally restructured so that they could only operate if they had a triple bottom line to look for not just profits, but also people and planet. And that would be something where they would lose their charter if they weren't actually totally shifting their orientation towards that triple bottom line. You'd look at things like universal basic income that was would be given as a fundamental right to every human being on this earth to be able to access what is really like the shared commonwealth of this incredible vast treasure house of technology and infrastructure and understanding that humanity has developed as a species over hundreds of thousands of years. So this notion is that we don't have to see civilization as being innately destructive of life. We do need to recognize that civilization as it has been, ever since really the rise of agriculture over thousands of years, has been destructive of a sustainable life. And we need to transform it in that basis so that we use technology, so that we use human ingenuity to find ways to actually enhance symbiosis with each other as human beings and with the living earth, rather than use that power to destroy or to reduce the richness and diversity and abundance of life. That is doable. It involves huge shifts away from where we are now. But what's so exciting is that the seeds of it are already in existence in all kinds, all manners of communities, ways of thinking, and different fields, different disciplines developing, of which, you know, I would just shout out to you, Danielle, as one of the leading thinkers in moving towards that different form of thinking about what civilization can be. So I want to thank you for that too.
No, I mean, we're all in this, like, as I said, I really find this more and more that it's wonderful to, because we're all from somehow different storylines, cultures, backgrounds, you can't communicate the richness and complexity of this in just one framing in one language, because one frame in one language will resonate more with one person and another with another. But as we begin to hold this underlying commonality, like we talked about this a few years ago, this amplifying each other's work and the similarities in it, rather than trying to distinguish, like,
right,
this, like I don't want to have a conversation about whether it's flourishing or thriving or regenerative. For me, they all describe a very similar impulse. I still use one more than I use the others, but I do use them somewhat interchangeably. Yeah? But there's a couple of things that I would like to pick up on. One of them was just to sort of, because we particularly with your first and now your second book, you so attentive to meaning and language and the power of language. The framing learning from nature, of course, is again othering nature by putting the article from in, like learning as nature is putting us in, like that, where I feel the richness of, and I'm definitely really looking forward to your second book coming out, because I love this animate intelligence.
Right.
And I'm excited to look at where that embodied re-inhabitation at the level of self as world, in a kind of
Yes.
Ananesian ecological self sense, is actually a kind of being shift that is then enabling the repatterning. There's one thing that you like is very briefly regressing back to the three horizons. Bill Sharp is currently helping future stewards and a number of this coalition that is being stewarded by a guy called Nigel Topping, who's the UK's, I've got a very poncy title, and what was it? High-level champion for COP26. What they're doing is they're bringing, I think it's about 130 people in different industries and areas into framing the transformation that is necessary in order to get to the zero carbon by 2050,
Right.
which we don't need to go into the detail of carbon myopia and all of that in that context, but it's still pushing in the right direction. And what Bill is doing is he's training all of them in the three horizon framing and language. So when COP26 happens, key negotiators will be familiar with this framing, and I'm really curious to see how that will unlock this deadlock of the climate conversation. But that was just I kind of regressed because I suddenly remembered that I didn't say that earlier. But the other bit is the bit about the triple bottom line, because John Elkington himself, who's the kind of father of the triple bottom line accounting approach, actually in Green Swans kind of did a product recall on the framing of the triple bottom line. And it relates to what I think is the essence of your first two books, is that you have to go into the culture and worldview and value system bit, the non-physical, like rather than the three-legged stool of sustainability or the three columns of sustainability. It's all about social, ecological, and economic benefit, people, planet, and it's not about profit, but it's the worldview that shifts everything fundamentally, and that I think that's your premise. So it's almost a quadruple bottom line. It like meaning needs to be the fourth bottom line.
Right. So well said. Yeah, I love that. And yeah, and that's really just gives a sense of this concept of an ecological civilization flows through everything. And again, it's not like an ecological economy. That's one part of it. But to really look at an ecological civilization means transforming our education, transforming our human interactions with each other, transforming the way we relate to the internet, transforming our agriculture, and moving towards bioregionalism, exactly the kind of work that you're focusing on right now. And so this is the notion of there is nothing that doesn't get transformed in the human experience, which is not the first time that's happened in humanity. As I look in the patterning instinct, when we moved from hunter-gatherers to agrarian culture, and when we went from agrarian worldviews to modern scientific worldviews a few hundred years ago, basically everything in the human experience changed as a result of those transformations. That's the kind of transformation that we need to get to that ecological civilization.
And yeah, and the interesting thing that like over the last 3-4 months, there's this new frame maturing in me, which is like somehow our Western pattern is a pattern of reducing complexity through abstraction.
Right.
And even if you abstracting patterns and abstracting understanding of dynamics and all that level, but there's another pathway of reducing complexity, which is through specification. So it's and this is where I think it links to the Regenesis Institute and that approach to regeneration, where they're very early on homed in on you can't heal the whole planet, but you can heal places. So and I would say that places, of course, places fractal, it's local, regional, and global, but it's through adapting culture to the biocultural uniqueness of place, through like basically ecosystems healing and healing the social fabric, healing the wounds of the past in order to move forward into a different future. And all of that is, it stops being abstract and theoretical the minute you engage a group of people that co-inhabit a place.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And
And that's where the work in bioregionalism is so important, because it all begins with people in place. And part of what we really need to do is rediscover our rootedness with our place, because without that, we can't be connected with the living earth in the most meaningful way. And at the same time, we have to be aware of the cosmopolitan concept of our interconnectedness with all of humanity all around the world and all of life all around the world. So again, it leads to this kind of dynamic. It's not one or the other, but it's being able to show how that place-based understanding and beingness integrates with the fullness of our sort of global planetary consciousness, or whatever. So, and I just want to say, I'm just keeping an eye on the time here, and I think we probably want to move towards
it's quite
some
late in the
closure
evening.
here for.
but it's just fascinating that everything that we've been exploring in the last hour and a half, I feel like if they didn't have Zoom back then, but if Patrick Geddes and Jan Christian Smuts would have had a conversation 110 years ago, they would have pretty much, in slightly different framings, they would have been talking about the same thing. So we, like, again, we're in an arch of history of coming to this, bringing this new way of participating as wholeness, in wholeness, as nature, in nature, into our awareness. So thank you so much for this time. This was fun. Like I really want to go for a walk or a kayak.
I know, exactly.
Like
exactly.
It's still only two-dimensional, but we will have time.
Right. Exactly. I look forward to that, as we all do, when we can be with each other in more kind of physical circumstances. So yeah, thank you, Danielle, and just want to say really thank you again for the incredible work that you're doing, and really reading your book, Designing Regenerative Economy, that really made a difference to me in terms of opening up many of my layers of understanding. So I'll always be grateful to you for that.
Well,
so.
as you spotted by me so blatantly saying a few things, and then you're saying, well, I actually write about this in my book. I haven't read every page yet, but I've just finally got my own copy in the mail. So I'm really looking forward.
Oh, great. Okay, super.
Over Christmas, and then the new one is coming out in June, you said. Yeah,
that's right, June 2021. So
and where do people find you?
Right, sure, yeah. Well, so the easiest thing to do is just go to my website, which is just jeremylent.com. It's that's kind of easy to remember. And if you're interested in exploring this a nonprofit Leology Institute, that's at leology.org, like liology.org. So.
Well, thanks so much, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And let's try to talk sooner rather than leave.
Very much. Look forward to it, Daniel. Thank you. Take care now.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.